I want to welcome everyone to your Smart Manager webinar. This is the first one of the year, so welcome. Today our topic, Unlocking Team Potential, a guide for motivation. I am your host, Matt Pambid, glad to be back and to help us understand better this topic. We've invited to the table Leslie Fiorenzo and Renee Ucanis. Welcome, presenters.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And Renee, this is your first time at the table, so welcome, and welcome back, Leslie.
Thanks.
Folks, you may have noticed that everyone's been muted. This way we can have a quiet learning environment, but we still want to hear from you. So if you have questions or comments, you can put them in that dialog box by clicking on that speech bubble icon there. And you may have heard me say, if you'd like to download a copy of this slide deck so that you can take notes or follow along, you can click on that document icon. And as a quick note, I know some folks are interested in getting a certificate of attendance. If that's you, at the end of this webinar, we'll have a very brief survey. In order to get that survey, make sure that when you exit, you click on the exit button at the bottom of that bar you see there. And it will pop up, and that way you'll be eligible for one of those certificates. So again, we're talking about unlocking team potential, a guide for motivation. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised to learn that team motivation, employee motivation is the #1 requested webinar from our audience. And so we've learned over the years, give them what they want. And sure enough, this webinar filled up right away. People are interested in this. We've also learned, though, anything we might have said about motivating your team over the past 2 years has changed radically because we've all been working differently, many people working from home, and we know that motivating a team remotely is different than what we used to do. We know Harvard Business Review did some research, and what they found was employees that had no choice where they worked were less motivated. They found that employees that were working from home were less motivated than people working in the office. And specifically, I thought the big takeaway was those who didn't have a choice about where they were working, they were the least motivated of all. And why I think that's important is because for many of us, we haven't had a voice in the last 2 years. Decisions been made for us, either by the company, by the state, by the government. And that choice has been taken away from us and has left too many of us feeling unmotivated. But we know that there are some things that smart managers can do starting today, if you're interested, that don't cost you anything, that can help you contribute to your organization's bottom line by increasing motivation. What we've done is break this down into 2 different categories that we'll be talking about. One is setting the stage for team motivation. Those are those things that we have to have in place so that we can do the second part of this presentation, those key components. What we're suggesting is if you don't have these initial components, setting the stage, none of that other stuff is going to matter. So first, we have to talk about these prerequisites, setting the stage, which we've identified as, irony of ironies, making sure you have the proper equipment to do your job, building a sense of trust, and focusing in on the individual and the team, not using a cookie cutter approach. And I say this with much irony because we were having some difficulty ourselves with the equipment here. And perhaps Leslie can attest how frustrating and demotivating that might have been a moment ago.
Well, mostly frustrating, Matt. I knew we would work it out, but it was at a moment in time.
So we want to make sure that we have the proper equipment. This is one of those prerequisites. Leslie, what can you tell us?
Well, Matt, maybe audience members are familiar with Marcus Buckingham's bestseller, First Break All the Rules. And in that book, he talks about Gallup's 12 questions. And question number 2, people might know this because a lot of companies use this too, but it says, do I have the materials and equipment I need to do my work? And one of the challenges that I think many companies face, especially in when people got sent home, maybe many people are still working at home, is trying to ensure people's connectivity. I know a friend of mine lives pretty far out of town, and she's been challenged at times with connectivity, and not much her employer can do about that. But the slide that you showed a couple back with the woman sitting on the floor against her couch with the laptop, for a lot of people, yeah, that one, that's been the reality about working at home. They haven't had a space necessarily to work. And so that's been problematic too. But to provide materials and upgrade, repair, get people what they need, replace, all of those kinds of things are really important. And no, I know they're expensive. Sometimes they're not within the particular manager's control, but doing what I can do to make sure people have what they need. I know when we shifted, Matt, and I wasn't at Uliance at the time, you could probably talk about that, but um, using the virtual platforms that many people weren't as familiar with them as they certainly are now.
Yeah, I know when COVID hit and we got the marching orders to stay home, our company, for example, we became team users, team experts literally overnight. We all had it on our computers, thankfully, um, but we weren't using it. And we are very heavily dependent on team. And that was something that our IT department had to be prepared for, had to make sure that we had adequate training for uh, and support.
Yeah. And that's the third idea behind equipment is that training. And a lot of people do provide technical skills training because it's often the technician, the best technician who's been promoted to the leader, the manager. But more importantly, it's what I think sometimes get labeled as soft skills training. But to me, those are power skills. Because when I have the skills to communicate effectively, build relationships with my coworkers, with my customers, with my vendors, all of those kinds of things that are really the key to success factors at work. That's what I want to be able to help my people do and equip my people to do.
And Renee, you had some ideas about building and enhancing the trust that people already have with their individual teams and team members. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so another factor to consider is being predictable. So when your employees can predict your availability, maybe the support they'll receive, their judgment, they'll be less anxious and less likely to maybe test out limits. So we know it's in like our human nature to test out limits when boundaries are unclear, they're not set in stone. So you want to let your employees, predict schedules, maybe the support they'll receive, and you'll have a better chance at building this motivation with them. Now, building this trust requires a deliberate plan. So it needs to be intentional, it needs to be meaningful. So make an actual plan to build that trust with your employees. So you can work with some key employees, maybe even consult with your account manager and members of your leadership. Now, this is also connected to a second important point. So we want to match our words with our actions. So mistrust arises when managers might not follow through or they don't do what they said they would. Now, most employees, now we understand like sometimes circumstances can prevent you from keeping a commitment. They'll forgive an occasional lapse, but a habit of not following through can tell people that you might not be trusted. So this factor is easy to overcome though. So one suggestion is that if you can't meet a promised deadline, tell your employees in advance. Being communicative, being open with your employees helps build on that trust with them.
Yeah, when I'm listening to you, what that kind of reminds me of, this idea about being predictable is I'm thinking about a parent who's, says, I'm going to ground you for a week. And then after a day, they let the kid off. That kid, not that, our employees are kids and not that as managers that we're parents, but I think there is some similarity there. That kid is always going to test the limits then because they are not predictable. Because they're going to say, well, geez, that one time I got off after just one day. So I'm going to go bug them. How about now? How about now? But if that parent was predictable and every single time when they said a week, it meant 7 days, they wouldn't ask anymore. They wouldn't have to do that. So I appreciate that you bring that to the table. And then Leslie, the last bullet point that we wanted to address when it comes to setting the stage before we can kick into gear those big ticket items, those key components, was focusing on the individual, focusing on the team. What do you know about that?
Well, the first thing we want to be aware of is the stories we tell ourselves or assumptions, and we want to avoid them. So every person is motivated by something different. And so it's a mistake to think that just everybody likes the same kind of award or recognition, everybody wants the same thing. And it's also a mistake to tell ourselves this worked before, so it should work now. So just be aware that people need and want different things. Years ago, I worked for a company and we decided to do some recognition for all our employees. We had a particular challenge, and several people stepped up to the cost saving challenge. And one person in particular generated an idea that saved the company a substantial amount of money. So we had a celebration, and we had at a offsite place, had a big stage, called the people who contributed up on stage, round of applause, award. This woman was horrified that she got called up onto stage. She was so embarrassed. She did not want public recognition. She liked to be behind the scenes, and she did like the little bonus that came with it, but she would have much preferred that her boss deliver that to her workstation and shook her hand as opposed to calling her out in front of the 100 and some employees that worked at the company.
I think that's a really good story. It's a myopic view from the manager's view of something like, well, I would like it, or other people would enjoy that. So therefore, and we can't think that way. And you just illustrated exactly why that's dangerous. That lady was mortified.
Yeah, she was. And it really did had for her had the opposite effect. It wasn't a motivator, it was a demotivator because she's like if this is how contribution is recognized, I'm not saying another word. We want to solicit feedback from our employees too. And it can be challenging to ask for feedback. It can be challenging to hear it, but check your ego at the door, if you will. And remember, it's not about you and your great ideas, but it's about the team, that we're all in this together. And so it's an opportunity to really listen, collect feedback from employees, and do what you can do to make things happen. As Matt said, no cookie cutter approach is necessary.
So we've discussed those things that you have to have in place, providing the right equipment and following up with that, making sure that it doesn't become old or stagnant, and providing the training if necessary, building and enhancing that trust, and throwing out the cookie cutter, focusing on the individual wants and needs of your individual employees and the team. And now that we have these things in place, now we can move on to those key components that we've identified as inspiring, empowering, guiding your team, and striking the right balance. Leslie, help us with what's the importance of inspiring the team and what are some do's and don'ts, would you say?
But one thing to keep in mind, and this is not a term I coined, I'm borrowing it from a colleague who I heard it from in Florida, but he would always say, in order to be terrific, you need to be specific. So when you're going to shower praise on someone, do it with a specific incident in mind. So be focused on what they've contributed, share some of the details, thank them, if you will, and then people love to hear their name. So using their name can be really helpful. We also want to be authentic. People can detect whether or not you're phony or whether or not you're sincere. And so, even if they aren't fully aware of why that's the case, we just have this in the back of our head. And the more inauthentic we are, it'll leave a bad taste in the mouths of your employees. So, the other thing to think about is even if your initial action is authentic, it's going to degrade everything else. So, we want to be aware of that. And then we also want to be timely as soon as it's practical after the event occurs. Even if at a later date, you might as a company be having a big award and recognition dinner or some kind of accolades, but going to that person and saying, hey, great job on the Tompkins account. Really appreciated the way you pitched in and covered or got those report details to me ahead of time, whatever it is, right? Just appreciated the fact that you showed up early and you were prepared. Whatever it is, be timely and be specific, um, and be honest.
You know what I'm liking about this? I mean, these are not earth-shattering ideas that you're putting on the table for us. These are the tried and true stuff. This is the stuff that is true and has been true for decades. And it's an excellent reminder at a time that we need to be reminded. Leslie, you had some ideas about the importance of empowering your employees.
Sure. So, what we want to be able to do to the greatest degree possible is give people the reins. Now, depending on their job and the climate of the company, it's not always possible, but we want to let employees be involved in decisions as much as they can. We want to reinforce positive behavior. So when we see something, when we see catch them doing right, I think is the phrase I've heard, and let people know what you appreciate that. Again, that specificity is can be important in recognizing their positive behavior. And then we want to provide leadership. Um,
I
and
know that I know that Renee had some ideas too
yeah,
about specifically how a manager can help develop leadership on a team. Renee, what did you have for us?
Yeah, so, an example could be like, a stretch assignment. This is a great way to allow employees to learn and adapt on new skills. And it's also a way that some employees prefer as their method of being reinforced for their positive behavior, as we mentioned before, to take on a new challenge for themselves. And another thing could be maybe delegating authority. Now, this one can be a little tricky, but it can demonstrate that you trust the employees, and this can empower your team. So maybe to go about this, you can provide some check-ins or follow-ups to ensure that the tasks and instructions are understood. And this is a great way to provide any feedback to your employees or receive any feedback at where they're at. And also providing the resources and training necessary for this part is also very essential. So that's one way you can go about it, delegating authority.
You know why I think that's smart is because it's tapping into some of our essential needs as human beings that need to be important, that need to be useful. They're universal, no matter what age or where you're from in this world, whatever year you were born, everybody needs those things. And developing that sense of leadership can contribute to that. Um, Leslie, now when we're talking about guiding
mhm.
um, the team, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's a couple things to think about, Matt. And first of all, when we think about the guide and it says provide the big picture, as a leader, what I want to be able to do is instill this sense of here's where we're going in this big sense of the word, that the final end goal. So if I think of a guide, and because I love the outdoors and I like to do things, although I've never done either one of these, climb a mountain or go on a like a several day canoe trip through the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. Friends just did that, so that's why it comes to mind. But they had a guide with them to help them get there, and so the guide has the big picture. And as a leader, sometimes we need to be able to take the small things that people do and help them envision the bigger picture. So one of the stories I love about this subject is a woman whose job it was to put the small plastic ends on shoelaces. And Matt's got a picture there. So those are called aglets, and they go in the eyelet of the shoe. And can you imagine standing all day at a press where you're doing that? But what motivated her was she envisioned the safely tied shoelaces of the children whose whose parents rather purchased those shoelaces for their child. So that's one way. The other day, and so the other idea is then to connect those dots. When employees feel like their work matters, like the woman I just talked about, her work matters because kids' shoes are safely tied. So help your employees see that big picture, connect the dots, and then ask people what they think. Again, this is an opportunity to ask for some feedback, but how do they see it? What interpretation did they have?
I think that's important too. Again, it helps the employees answer a big question, which is, why am I here? Why am I doing this?
Mhm.
I mean, that is another universal need. These are brilliant ideas that you're giving us. And again, they're timely. Renee, were you talking about striking a balance? What does that mean in terms of wanting to motivate a team?
Yeah, so in the end, you want to find a happy medium with your employees. You want that balance. So, one thing is you want to carefully monitor the amount of attention and direction you might give your employees. So, we all know like micromanagement is a motivation killer. But on the flip side, not paying enough attention to your employees can also be demotivating as well. So, in today's environment, maintaining that communication is especially important as employees are now working remotely, some in hybrid, some you don't even see in the office for long periods of time. So it's easy for virtual employees to kind of get lost or maybe feel out. So we want to prevent that from happening. So make sure that employees are invited to maybe department meetings, they're kept up with all company communications, and they aren't left out of any discussions that could impact their roles. So teams, you can stay connected through maybe video calls, virtual team lunches, instant messaging. So one thing that we mentioned before, like Alliance has become very reliant on that program, Microsoft Teams, where we can start a quick chat with someone or even do a video call. And then a final point is making time. So being available for your employees. So you can do this by making time in your schedules for those check-ins or follow-ups. Maybe you want to schedule some consistent follow-ups, a meeting with, your employees to touch base on things.
Now, we're not going to go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say one of the things that in doing some consulting with companies is just kind of interesting to me, this idea of making time. And that can be a real challenge for managers to try to fit that in their schedule. But I've got consistent feedback from people who had not done that and then began the practice of scheduling FaceTime with people, whether it's on a video chat or if they're in the office, meeting in a conference room or in the boss, wherever makes sense, office. What a difference that made in the performance of the employee. And it doesn't have to be an hour at a time, it could be 10 to 20 minutes at a time. But making it very consistent, I think, is the key. And again, Renee talked about that expectation that I know you're going to be there and that we can always count on this. And people will forgive the occasional one off. But when it's all the time, then I'm going to come to know you're not true to your word. So just a thought.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you absolutely have to be deliberate about it. Let me ask this tough question, actually. So let's say, you want to start some of these goals to have increased trust, to have increased motivation. I would suggest you would want to develop goals. I'm repeating myself, but smart goals, goals that are measurable. How do you measure? How would you suggest a manager go about measuring some of these things that are sort of intangible, like, for example, trust. How do you measure something like that? How do you put that in goal form?
Well, one of the ways I think a manager could measure trust is by communication on the team
Yeah,
and maybe how quickly people volunteer. But then when a question's asked, is it met with silence or are people willing to share diverse opinions? I think that Matt and Renee, you remember a couple weeks ago on our team meeting, we had a really interesting discussion and people kind of pushed back on some of the ideas that were presented. And we came to a great resolution, but I think we have a high level of trust among the account managers and our leader here at Uliance. And I think we might be unique in that. I know that doesn't happen in every place that I've worked. I don't know about the two of you.
well, I think another thing that we have going for us is that we've been together for a little while and we're able to build up a sense of trust. I could see a challenge would be if you always had rotating members in your group and how that could present a challenge.
Yeah.
But still something that can be overcome. You know, something I noticed, to provide a real life example too of something that Renee was saying about the importance of making time for your employees. Like our manager of account services, we have a weekly hour staff meeting. She'll
Mhm.
jump on the meeting like 5 minutes early while we're just chatting, talking about the weather. And she's part of that. She could wait to the very last minute
Mhm.
and jump on, but she makes a point to get on early to make time for us.
Mhm.
Hey, I want to remind the audience too, don't forget that you have an EAP available to you. You have an entire think tank available to you. So don't be shy about calling your account manager if you have questions about team building, about building trust, about how to make time. Also check out our portal where they have a bunch of other webinars that have already been recorded, ready and waiting for you. And I want to thank our presenters, Leslie and Renee. I think you added a lot of common sense, tried and true ideas that I needed to be reminded of. So I very much appreciate your input.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for the opportunity, Matt.